I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce Florian Kaiser, today's Graumann lecturer, on behalf of the Environmental Psychology section of the German Psychological Society. Although many of you may say, no one has to introduce Florian because most of us know him quite well. And of course, indeed, Florian is one of the most visible and successful researchers in our field. The metrics are fine. He published a lot, very productive researcher, about 95 peer-reviewed journal articles, many of them published in the most influential outlets of environmental psychology and social psychology. He received his PhD at the University of Bern in 1992. Then he worked at various universities, Berkeley, ETH Zurich, and then he moved to the Technical University of Eindhoven, where he received his first professor position, and since 2008, he's a full professor of social and personality psychology at the University of Magdeburg, where he's running a program on environmental psychology together with Ellen Mattis and others. What is Florian's research about? I think one of the most important research questions that we can associate with him is the question, what determines environmental behavior? And this is important, why? These why questions. His approaches are informed by basic research, and in turn, they inform basic research themselves. So Florian's work is definitely relevant beyond the borders or boundaries of our field. And Florian was, and still is, extremely important, I think, for advancing environmental psychology as a rigorous and well-respected science. He served as editor of the Journal of Environmental Psychology and the editorial board of Environmental Behavior. And perhaps most importantly, in the present context, he is one of the most important facilitators of this conference of ICEP. Personally, I met Florian in 1997 when I was a master's student and I attended the second conference of the Environmental Psychology section of the German Psychological Society at the University of Düsseldorf. And if you should be interested what Florian presented there, I have the conference book in my bag, so you can approach me and can look at the conference book 1997. Florian later on organized this conference for the first time outside Germany at the University of Eindhoven. And for the first time, the conference language was English, which was kept for the following conferences. And the conferences attracted more and more of an international audience, and then it became clear that it had become a truly international conference. And then it became BICEP and finally ICEP. Wesley mentioned that yesterday. And Florian was always one of those who facilitated this process, and he also offered that the German Environmental Psychology section would still contribute to this ICEP conference, for example, by convening the Graumann lecture that we have today. Okay, but back to 1997, to Düsseldorf. It was a group of around 90 participants, no parallel sessions, and Florian presented a poster. To be honest, I do not remember much details of this conference. But what I remember, and whom I remember, is Florian vigorously discussing with colleagues, preferably Sebastian Bamberg, about the if and why of attitude-behavior gaps. Florian always tried hard in challenging established positions. And still today, one of the most frequent Florian sentences is, "You know, I'm not convinced." This is the attitude of a devoted scientist. this is a true role model, I think. And there is no gap between this attitude and Florian's behavior. So, let him try to convince us today. And if not, let's have a friendly but vigorous discussion afterwards. Florian, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Emo. I think this was the nicest way to say that I'm quite a pain. So I appreciate that. Dear fellow scientists, colleagues, friends, you will see that in my today's presentations, I haven't moved far from the Düsseldorf, actually, discussions. Let me start, however, with expressing my gratitude to the organizers, Giuseppe Carus and Luigi Alini, for nominating me for this keynote. I would also like to thank the Environmental Psychology Special Interest Group, represented by Imo Fritsche, for awarding me the Graumann lecture. And finally, I'm most grateful to the Environmental Psychology Division of the International Association of Applied Psychology, represented by its steering committee, Terry, Wes, and Sabina, for its patronage of this wonderful conference and for the opportunity for all of us to get together. In my today's presentation, in the honor of the late Carl Friedrich Graumann, I will talk about people's inherent commitment to protecting the environment and how important this commitment actually is for behavior. My lecture is entitled, as you can see, Protecting the Environment for Its Own Sake Against All Odds. Marcus Aronen and Laura Brinkman from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands argue in their article published recently in Perspectives on Psychological Science that cumulative sciences need to recognize their phenomena. This is because phenomena operate as critical constraints for novel theories. In other words, any new theory must also explain how a scientific discipline's phenomena come about. Aronen and Brinkman's call made me wonder about the phenomena in environmental protection research. Of one, I'm quite confident that it's found resonance in environmental psychology, the attitude-behavior gap. You see, I'm still in Düsseldorf. Let me begin my presentation with describing the attitude-behavior gap. People do people do not follow up on opinions they verbally express. For example, even though a majority argues that it's everyone's responsibility to pick up litter, only a minority actually does so. And even though a majority claims to generally act pro-environmentally, only a minority turns down heating when they leave their homes for more than 4 hours. These and similar such findings have repeatedly been documented in the past. Two things can be concluded from such findings. Verbally expressed opinions are poor indicators of what people actually do. And as a consequence, opinions are poor reflections of people's motivational force behind behavior. In today's presentation, the first question I will address is, how can we actually identify what I just called the motivational force behind behavior? How much people personally care about the environment, or how committed they are to protecting the environment? In the second part of my presentation, I will provide evidence in support of the notion that the motivational force causally accounts for pro-environmental behavior as it is supposed to do. Specifically, I will demonstrate that behavior has a good chance to become manifest when people's commitment is strong enough to countervail the costs of a behavior. In the third, and final part of my presentation, I will bring evidence for two levers, the two distinguishable levers for behavior change to the foreground. Behavior cost, with which we can amend specific behavior, and commitment, with which we can produce cumulative behavior effects. Essentially, the latter is presumably the biggest single contribution to the praxis of environmental protection and to climate change mitigation research and its praxis. Before we have a look on the question how we can identify the strength of people's commitment to environmental protection, we need to talk about behavior. Because of its corporal nature, behavior carries costs. Such costs refer to obstacles or to personal resources that a behavior requires. Time, money, exertion, diligence. Recycling glass, for example, means that I have to collect the glass and bring it to a recycling container. Carpooling with others involves that I have to stick to a time schedule. Donating money means I cannot spend the money for some personal issues any longer. Whereas some behavior is high cost, others is low cost, and many are in between, as you see on the slide. Now, if you wanted to identify a person's commitment to a goal, for example, protecting the environment, that is hidden somewhere in people's minds, how would you do that? Or let's take another example. If you wanted to find out whether your next seat neighbor is committed to running a marathon, how would you find out? What would you do? Anybody a possible answer? What would you do? Ask, right. We could ask. What could we do else? Oh, we could observe whether he runs regularly. Right. These are the only two answers I actually had myself. So, as my colleagues and I have argued in several articles, people's personal commitment to a goal, such as running a marathon or protecting the environment, can be identified when we consider the persistence and the convergence of people's goal striving. Persistence despite any costs that obstruct goal attainment. For that, we have to focus on all kinds of behavior, bike riding, expressions of support for environmental protection, and so forth. Behaviors presumed to be instrumental for attaining the environmental protection goal. Predictably, person's B's commitment to a goal shows in what B says and does, and in the costs B overcomes. Quite like in Disney fairy tales, when the princess recognizes the guy with a genuine affection for her in the person that stays with her against all odds. The guy that ignores all risks and obstacles to simply keep the princess out of harm's way. You can actually turn that gender stereotype around if you wish. I'm just referring to a Disney narrative. We can also look at Bertolt Brecht's famous play, The Caucasian Chalk Circle, when the judge recognizes the child's real mother, the actual stepmother in the play, by the way, in the person who sacrifices personal interests, her own interests, for the child's welfare. In other words, people's commitment becomes apparent in the costs that people overcome. The more a person does, the more costs he or she offsets, the more committed the person is, for example, to protecting the environment for the goal's own sake. According to this view, commitment to the environmental protection goal represents the motivational force behind the various protective activities. The commitment shows in the engagement likelihoods of all the behaviors that are generally considered instrumental for protecting the environment. You see that on the right-hand side indicated. These would be the behavioral likelihoods of a person B with a given motivation. The stronger people's commitment, the more likely the behaviors that help protecting the environment, and vice versa. The less likely the behaviors that help protecting the environment, the weaker people's commitment to the environmental protection goal. The relationship between engagement likelihood of behavior, a person's commitment, and the costs of a behavior is, as we have argued in several articles, actually formally depicted with the Rush model. Let's make the story a bit more intuitive. We want to find out about the person most committed to environment protection in this room. For that, please rise. In the following, I will confront you with 7 statements. If you consent to the statement or can confirm engagement, you may remain standing. If you disagree with the statement or cannot confirm engagement, you please sit down. And you remain seated after once sat down, even if you can consent or confirm the next statement. Easy rules? Let's start. Environmental protection is important. That will be my first statement. I recycle glass and paper. Very good. I commute by bike or public transportation. Walking is fine. I refrain from owning a car. You know, that's not I don't possess one. I refrain from owning one means I resist owning one. I'm a member of an environmental organization. Now we are getting more tricky here. Next one is for the diehards. I'm a vegetarian or vegan. And now comes the impossible task. I refrain from traveling out of my country. So I think there is one raised hand on the computers at the moment. So after we learned how we can find out how committed a person is to protecting the environment, we now continue to the theory that explains all behaviors instrumental for attaining the environmental protection goal, from signing a petition over donating money to environmental organizations and recycling papers to buying organic food. According to the proposed theory, any specific pro-environmental behavior, for some reason that the pointer seems not to work. Do we have another pointer? Any specific pro-environment behavior depends on people's commitment on the one hand and on the behavioral costs. Either people's commitment to environmental protection is strong enough to countervail the behavioral costs, or the behavioral costs are so low that they countervail a lack of people's commitment. For a person to pass the threshold of engagement that is indicated with the dashed line with PNI, with the probability of a person N to engage in behavior I. For a behavior to pass the threshold for engagement, behavior I has only marginal costs, or person N's commitment to environmental protection is strong enough to offset the costs of the behavior. In other words, if people's commitment is strong, even the high-cost behavior has a good chance to being performed. That's indicated with the green arrow. Behavior has identically the same good chance to being implemented if a person's pro-environmental commitment is weak, when the behavioral costs are low, which is indicated with the red arrow. In the following, I'll provide evidence in support of this theory. The evidence was published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology. In their online experiment, Oliver Taube and Max Vetter accounted for the share of green products after each of the 231 participants had worked off a shopping list consisting of 5 products, such as chocolate, herbal tea, dish liquid, and toilet cleaner. One group was exposed to obstructive conditions. You see something? It is on. Okay. So you see this one? Oh, you see this one. Now I'm confused. Okay. Anyway, we'll find our way. Otherwise, Immo will actually point. One group was exposed to obstructive conditions represented by a conventional supermarket, whereas... Okay.
This one works.
Okay. Oh, it's tiny. One group was exposed to the obstructive conditions represented by a conventional supermarket, whereas the other group was exposed to supportive conditions represented by a supermarket specialized in green products. In the supportive condition, when the green products were default, Taube and Vetter found the expected higher proportion of products selected. Wherever. In the obstructive condition, when conventional products were default, green products had to be searched at some cost of time and convenience. Under these obstructive conditions, the proportion of green products was much smaller. That's the dashed line here. Sorry. The share of green products was, next to its sensitivity to cost, also sensitive to people's personal commitment to environmental protection. With increasing commitment, you see basically the proportion of pro-environmental consumption increased as well. Note that the dotted lines around the regression lines indicate the 95% confidence interval. With their research, Taube and Vetter found that both factors, behavioral costs and commitment, significantly controlled behavior. They did, however, not mutually depend on each other. In other words, they did not interact in a statistical sense. That's actually here. We can conclude that people are, as predicted, equally likely to choose green products when people's commitment to environmental protection was strong, or when the boundary conditions were supportive and green products were readily available at no extra cost in terms of time loss or inconvenience. This countervailing commitment cost relationship implies that the costs become obvious in the commitment required from the actor. Thus, we can expect when people pass the threshold to actively protecting the environment and become actors by, for example, avoiding cars for their commutes, actors on average harbor a stronger commitment to environmental protection than non-actors. People who do not protect the environment in the same way. In other words, manifest engagement of actors in a behavior expectedly corresponds with stronger commitment compared to non-actors. You can see this actually depicted with the green and red arrow. Actors just pass the threshold of engagement, and they are expected to hold a stronger environmental commitment, and non-actors do not pass the threshold of engagement, and they, on average, hold a lower environmental commitment. In a field experiment that was recently published in Personality and Individual Differences, we tested this presumed difference in commitment of almost 400 actors and non-actors. For that, we compared the pro-environmental commitment of two groups of people. People who engaged in a comparatively high-cost, environmentally protective behavior, people who used bikes and public transportation for their commutes, against people who used cars for their commutes. We expected that bike and public transportation commuters come with extra exertion and inconvenience cost, especially with longer commutes. Our participants were employees of the Max Planck Institute in Magdeburg and our university in Magdeburg. They were approached upon arrival at work, in the parking lots, at the bicycle racks, or at public transportation stops, so that we actually could visually confirm their travel mode. As anticipated, we found the pro-environmental commitment of environmentally protective non-car commuters to be on average higher than the commitment of the non-protective car commuters, offsetting the behavioral costs that come with avoiding the car requires a comparatively stronger commitment than commuting with one's car. In a second such comparison, we explored the pro-environmental commitment of about 250 university students in Constance and in Magdeburg. Both cities are located in Germany as well. Again, we approached potential participants as they arrived at the university building after their travel mode was visually confirmed. This time we distinguished between bike commuters and the less protective public transportation commuters. Again, in both cities, we found bike commuters to be more committed to environmental protection than public transportation commuters. That's on the left-hand side, you see the bike commuters, on the right-hand side, the public transportation commuters. Additionally, we found students in Constance to be comparatively more committed to environmental protection than students in Magdeburg. That was quite a surprise. One explanation that we later found is an exertion effect. Whereas Magdeburg has a rather flat topography, and the university sits on the same level as the surrounding neighborhoods, the University of Constance, by contrast, is located on a hilltop and requires a climb of about 50 meters to reach. Apparently, only relatively more committed students even consider bike and public transportation commutes in Constance rather than that they use the car. That explains the significant difference between the two cities. Although encouraging with objectively manipulating costs, we can of course not be 100% certain that actual costs are the cause for environmental protective activities of the actors. And it's the elevated pro-environmental commitment that actually makes the difference to the non-actors. In this lab experiment, Florian Lange made his 183 student participants choose between two travel modes, car and bicycle. Choosing the environmentally protective bicycle option had, compared with the car option, objective costs and extra waiting time. When choosing the bicycle, participants had to wait either 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, or 60 seconds longer. This extra waiting time distinguished 6 otherwise perfectly identical behaviors. Each of the 6 waiting times was presented 4 times to each participant. With a specific waiting time, participants had 4 opportunities to choose the bicycle over the car, and that way protect the environment. As a consequence, people's manifest pro-environmental engagement could have a score between 0 and 4. In the lenient interpretation, you see this indicated with lenient. In the lenient interpretation of environmental protection, we coded the behavior protective when participants chose the bicycle on at least one of the 4 occasions with the same waiting time. In our strict interpretation, indicated with strict, of pro-environmental protection, we coded the behavior protective when the bicycle choice was exclusive, when the bicycle was chosen in 4 out of 4 times, when in with a certain waiting time. In our test, we then connected the objective delays people endured with their commitment strength. The commitment strength is on the y-axis. Irrespective of whether we applied the lenient or the strict view of environmental protection, we basically found that the stronger people's pro-environmental commitment, the longer waiting times people endured for the bicycle choice. Obviously, our results are in line with the notion that increasing behavioral costs are countervailed with increasingly stronger commitments. What becomes also apparent from the graph on this slide is that a lenient understanding of environmental protection renders parts of the bicycle choices overly undemanding. These 2 down here. Even participants with extremely weak pro-environmental commitments were ready to protect the environment at least once when the bicycle choice extended their waiting time by not more than 5 or 10 seconds. It needed not much commitment, so everybody almost tried it at least once. In summary, we can conclude that people's commitment reflects the behavioral costs people countervail when they protect the environment. However, this becomes only recognizable when the objective costs of environmental protection are demanding enough to differentiate people in their respective commitment levels. After this evidence in support of our theory that explains environmentally protective behaviors in all its forms, we are now ready to move on to the third part and the final part with the question, how can we actively promote people's pro-environmental behavior? How can we do something? If manifest engagement in a specific behavior depends on costs of the behavior, we can, of course, manipulate the boundary conditions and make the conditions supportive enough to offset an eventual weakness in people's commitment by removing obstacles of behavior. In some research tradition, the removal of behavioral costs is actually called nudging. Alternatively, we can also add some behavioral benefits. Such facilitators of behavior can be formally described as negative costs. So benefits are negative costs. If commitment to environmental protection in the population is not strong enough to result in a high proportion of vegetarian lunch choices, we can, for example, provide monetary rewards and that way create supportive boundary conditions so that people eventually favor vegetarian over non-vegetarian dishes. We can reinforce the likelihood of vegetarian lunches with a benefit. Expectedly, vegetarian dishes will become more popular among people and thus more probable for any single individual. You see that indicated with the engagement likelihoods or the improvement of the engagement likelihood of this singular behavior. In a field experiment together with Laura Henn and Beatrice Marschke, I tested this prediction. The 141 students in the experimental group received a financial reward of €2 for every vegetarian lunch chosen at the university cafeteria during an intervention week. A reward that the 150 students in the control condition did not receive. We predictably found, with increasingly stronger commitment to environmental protection, students at increasingly higher shares of vegetarian lunches. That are the slightly increasing regression lines, regardless of the costs. More interestingly, though, we also found that with the monetary reward, vegetarian lunches received an extra boost. That's from the dashed line to the straight line, received an extra boost of a share of about 30 to a share of about 55%. Vegetarian lunches became 25% more popular, thus 25% more probable for any individual student. This is regardless of the student's pre-existing pro-environmental commitment, which becomes apparent in the non-significant statistical interaction again. Interestingly, this extra boost was short-lived and not sustainable. The share of vegetarian lunches dropped back to 30% after we withdrew the reward, when the behavioral costs were again back to normal. Our finding speaks of the continued behavioral relevance of people's personal commitments. We have still this increase. And it also speaks of the short-lived nature of cost interventions. Costs endure only as long as they are modified. Thus, I would caution against holding overly high hopes that financial rewards or other alterations of the costs of a behavior result in a long-term, in a lasting change in people's behavior. Cost effects are short-lived because alterations of costs do not really reinforce people's commitment or motivation to protecting the environment. In the following, I will move to an intervention that has, by contrast, the potential to produce lasting change in people's behavior. Instead of altering the costs of specific behaviors and make the behaviors lower cost to countervail the existing weakness in people's commitment, we can actually alternatively fortify people's commitment to protect the environment. Because people's pro-environmental commitment shows, as I've argued, in the occurrence probabilities of all behaviors presumed to be instrumental for environmental protection, the reinforcement of commitment necessarily shows in a general behavior effect, in an increase in the likelihoods of a multitude of behaviors simultaneously. Thus, when an intervention successfully fortifies the strength of people's commitment, spillover behavior effects are the axiomatic consequence. In their research, Laura Henn and colleagues tested this prediction experimentally, and you will hear about this experiment in her session even more and in more detail. Participants in this field experiment, participation in this field experiment was voluntary. 81 participants were in the experimental and 152 in the control group. The intervention to change people's pro-environmental commitment lasted for 7 months and consisted of 8 individual measures: a voucher of approximately 335 euro. The voucher was redeemable in household products such as water and energy-saving devices, a monthly newsletter on sustainability, a Facebook group to exchange with each other, an opportunity to engage in reflective blog writing, home audits, 3 regional social networking events, an online Q&A session with experts on energy efficiency, and a workshop on food self-sufficiency that involved even information on how to reduce food waste, and it involved a food waste challenge on top of it. The mixed ANOVA revealed a significant interaction between group and assessment time. See the figure on the left side. Error bars indicate the 95% confidence intervals, and the orbits around the confidence intervals represent the distribution, that's the vertical expansion, and the density, that is the horizontal expansion of the respective data. The effect can be attributed to an increase in the environmental protection commitment in the experimental group, but not in the control group. The intervention-induced increase in the strength of people's commitment can be translated into an increase in the engagement likelihood of the average behavior of 27%. If the typical pro-environmental behavior had a 50-50 chance to begin with, after the intervention it was much more likely with 77%. There was no such improvement in the control group. This boost in people's commitment can be described as a general behavior effect. This general effect shows in a shift of the trajectory of the engagement likelihoods of all pro-environmental behaviors that represent people's commitment. That's the figure on the right-hand side. Whereas the lower trajectory represents the commitment and thus the engagement likelihoods before the intervention, the upper trajectory represents the commitment and thus the engagement likelihoods after the intervention, the engagement likelihoods that could be expected with a commitment increase of the size of the magnitude that we found. The dashed line, by contrast, that you see around the upper trajectory, the dashed line represents the observed engagement likelihoods of the 29 behaviors and statements that we monitored in our study. Of the 29 pro-environmental statements and behaviors, the majority, 19, corresponded with the spillover that could have been expected as a consequence of the observed increase in people's commitment. Only 10 did not fall within the confidence interval of the expected trajectory. 6 commitment indicators increased to a disproportionately lower level. These are the ones below the confidence interval. 4 commitment indicators, 6 and 4 commitment indicators became disproportionately more likely, the ones above, 2 of which involved verbal statements of the type that people appeared more confident in their ability to protect the environment. 2 others were behaviors of which participants had received a benefit in the term of the shopping voucher. Could be used for energy efficient devices and LED lamps. So basically an extra benefit created this extra boost. This field experiment reveals, as I believe, that a fortification of people's pro-environmental commitment results in the anticipated behavioral spillover, in a systematic increase in people's general propensity to countervail costs. That shows not only in the increase in the engagement likelihoods, but also in the apparent decrease of costs. So people were, with their commitment, more ready to overcome additional costs. So, I suppose that some of you had expected I would give a lecture about environmental attitude. Let me talk about attitudes just now. Attitudes represent quite traditionally unobservable, subjective reasons for people's actions, sitting somewhere in people's minds. Such reasons capture personal goals. For example, I intend to protect the environment. If we argue consciously or unconsciously, it doesn't matter at all. If we argue that people act for reasons, we basically claim that people aspire attaining goals for the goal's own sake. And goals are, per definition, motivationally relevant for people's behavior. In this line of thinking, environmental attitude refers to the environmental protection goal of people. I took the liberty to call this motivational aspect of environmental attitude people's commitment to protecting the environment in my today's presentation. In its role as a motivational force, environmental attitude must, in our empirical studies, causally account for people's manifest pro-environmental protection behavior, for which I have presented evidence examples in my today's presentation as well. In contrast to this view, attitudes also refer to verbally stated opinions, such as protecting the environment is important. Such verbally stated opinions typically are low cost and as such poor reflections of people's motivation. Not surprisingly, opinions are poor measures of the strength of people's environmental protection motivation. When we in psychology speak of an attitude-behavior gap, we obviously mistake the low-cost voicing of opinions for the sound measurement of the motivating force behind people's behavior. Thus, this is why I suggest that we preferably talk about an opinion-behavior gap and not of an attitude-behavior gap. The alternative, a gap between behavior and its motivating force, inevitably questions the behavior relevance of goals. Contesting the behavior relevance of personal goals as a reason behind goal-directed behavior would repudiate one of the fundamental postulates of a psychology in the tradition of William James. In today's presentation, I argued that a person's environmental attitude, the personal strength of people's commitment, becomes visible in the cost a person ignores when he or she strives to attain his or her environmental protection goal. In other words, the cost people offset or have offset in the past can be used to measure people's environmental attitudes. Because of Donald Campbell's pioneering observation that people's attitudes become visible if costs are countervailed against all odds, we call our theory the Campbell paradigm. In our new and advanced version, the Campbell paradigm consists, as I demonstrated, of a measurement theory and a behavior explanation theory. The measurement theory equates, that's very important, equates in its current form the strength of people's attitudes with the engagement likelihoods of a behavior, of all the behaviors that are actually instrumental for attaining the environmental protection goal. The behavior explanation theory makes use of people's attitudes as one of the two causes of behavior. The other cause are the costs of a behavior. Costs, in turn, are fashioned by the boundary conditions, the environment in which behavior takes place. For behavior to have a reasonable chance to become manifest, either people's environmental attitudes are strong enough to countervail the costs of this behavior, or the behavioral costs are so low that they countervail the lack of environmental attitudes. This specific explanation of behavior offers, as we have seen, two general effective levers for behavior change. We can nudge a specific behavior, that is, we can reduce the cost of a behavior such as a vegetarian lunch choice, or we can actually strengthen people's environmental attitudes, because changes in people's attitudes necessarily imply cumulative and thus general behavior effects. The promotion of and the search of ways to promote attitudes should, as I believe, become center stage in environmental psychology. This is because attitude-induced spillover behavior effects are lasting and do not need any monitoring or further reinforcements, and because spillover behavior effects easily outperform the strongest specific economic behavior effects. So, let me end by bringing some of my colleagues to your attention who helped developing the Campbell paradigm, and now I'm ready to get your questions.